First, before I begin, I just wanted to thank Margaret, Abby, Wajid, and Matthew for letting me speak here today. Um, I've been wanting to do it for a while, and I was waiting for a topic that I thought would be the basically something that I thought would be useful to somebody who was in my position like 3 or 4 months ago. So I came across building my first piece of rack middleware not long after starting my first job in development, and I thought that might be transferable to some people who are here. So rack is basically the foundation in which a lot of Ruby web frameworks are built on top of now, like Rails, for example. And just for some comparison, here are some gems that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And this is how many times have been downloaded off of rubygems.org as of about an hour ago. And as you can see, Rack has surpassed 100 million downloads and is number 2 on the total download list, behind only Rake. So I thought I'd start by talking about the purpose of Rack. So right now, when a request comes in on your server, it's met by one of these application servers that then have to send it off to your Rails application or Sinatra or whichever other framework you're using. And if it wasn't for Rack, these would all have to implement handlers for each framework. And I'm only showing 4 frameworks and 4 servers here, and as we all know, there's a lot more. So this is pretty redundant and or pretty messy right now as it stands. So this is where Rack comes into play. Oops. So as you can see, it sits in between, and it allows you as a developer to, if you want to use one of these frameworks, or if you just want to start developing your own, something I highly recommend. It's good practice. You can build your framework on top of Rack, and the servers, all they need to do is be able to speak to Rack directly instead of your application in particular. So let's take a look at how that works. So it's a very minimal interface written in Ruby for developing Ruby web applications. It wraps your HTTP requests and responses in Ruby objects that make it very manageable for you to work with. And it allows Rack applications to actually be chained together so that you can have several Rack middleware applications running between a request coming in and your final framework at the end, which is something that I thought was really interesting when I came across it. So Rack applications, they have to be a Ruby object that has a call method. This is typically done by writing your own class that has a call method, but you can also, if you want to go even simpler, you can use a proc or a lambda, since they both implement call as well. It accepts a single parameter, which is a hash that contains information about the request in the server, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. And it has to return an array with exactly 3 elements. So the first of those is an integer, and that represents the status code, like 200 for OK, 404 for not found, and so on. The second element is a hash. Now this contains your response headers. It can contain whatever response headers you want. It doesn't have to be one that fits any particular standard. But the one requirement in there is that you have to include a content type, otherwise it won't function properly. And the final element is an enumerable. It represents the body of your application, so all the content, it represents the content for your response. And it needs to be able to respond to .each, so it's going to be something that you typically will just wrap a string in an array, for example, or other types of response content in an array just to make it enumerable. So here's what that application would look like at its very simplest. You have the call method with the one parameter that it accepts. You have an array that has 3 elements: the status code, the response headers, and the response body. And that's all you need to do for developing the most simple of Rack applications. On the application server side, if you ever happen to be writing one, you'll need to create a class within the Rack handler namespace. It has to have a run method and that method is going to accept your rack application or somebody else's rack application as the parameter for its run method. And the reason that the call method is a requirement for a rack application is because the app server's run method is going to invoke call. So it's going to invoke call and pass it that env hash that gives you all the information about a request and the server. So here's how it would look at its very simplest level to instantiate a rack application and pass it into a server. And to take a look at middleware, it's a little bit different than a basic rack application. So to begin, I'll just take a look at the response without any middleware. You have a request that comes in to your server, such as Puma or Thin or Unicorn or something of that nature. That server passes it off to your application, and the application takes that request and devises an appropriate response, sends the response back to the server, which gives it back to the client who made the request in the first place. Now with middleware, you can have these little middleware apps that chain together in between the server and the application. And along the way, each one is calling the call method of the next one in the chain. So once it gets to the final application, that one creates the response that you want, and it sends it back along the same line, starting with the last one that called that application. It just bubbles up right back to the server. One thing to note here is that these pieces of middleware in between, if they want, they don't need to actually call the next one in the chain. They can break the chain and just start bubbling back up to the server from there. Sorry here. So a rack middleware class, if you're defining one, must include all requirements of a rack application. So it has to have that call method, accepting a single parameter and returning an array of 3 elements. It has to have a constructor, unlike the application that accepts a single parameter. The constructor, the initialize method, is going to be called a single time, and that's going to be called when you start your server. It won't be called anytime after that, as far as I've learned. And it's that point that you establish the chain of apps. The call method is not going to be called when you start the server. It's going to be called instead when an HTTP request comes in and your app server starts going down the chain and looking for a response to that request. And typically the next middleware or the application, calls the next middleware or the final application in the chain using .call, as I was mentioning a few moments ago. So here's, again, another very basic implementation of middleware. It's going to have that constructor. It's going to store the parameter that it accepts, typically in an instance variable, so that you have access to call the next one in a chain once call is invoked. And call will give you back your 3 elements of your array. So you can, within a piece of middleware, for example, if you want this middleware to add a specific response header, you can just modify the header and then return these 3 in an array to its calling application. So I thought I'd finish off with a quick demo and just show a very basic implementation of rack. Can everybody see that? All right. So obviously we need to require rack. If you haven't already, you probably have it installed, but you could just gem install rack if you don't yet. Oh, sorry. Just going to define my application here. So I just want to define that call method. I'm going to give it a status code of 200, content type of text/HTML. All right, so that's all we need to do to define the application. Now, if I want to run it on a web server, I'm just going to instantiate it. I'm just going to change the name actually, since And then I just pass that instance of, or that Ruby object basically into the run method of a server. So I'm going to choose thin. Now if I open up the terminal, hopefully everybody's able to see that as well. All I need to do is just like any other Ruby file, just run Ruby and the name of the file. Hopefully that works. So it's saying that it's running my application now on localhost port 8080. So I'm going to check it out and make sure that it's working properly. So there we have it. That's working. And this is one of the most basic applications you can make, but it's good to know like the foundations where everything else is built from. Now if we want to iterate on that a little bit, one of the things that's really flawed here is that I'm going to have to stop the server every time I want to make a change while I'm developing it. So I'm going to refactor this a little bit and put part of this application into a rackup file or .ru file. So I'm going to leave the application where it is and take the part that calls it, put it in here. And since this is a rackup file, I don't need to actually specify that I am running a rack handler. All I need to do is specify run, and it's going to run my application. It's going to just auto-detect which server it thinks it should be run on. So you can obviously specify your own if you want to implement bundler and require a specific server. That's entirely possible. So I'm just going to run this one. Instead of running Ruby and then the file name, this one, I'm going to type rackup. And that will accept a file name. So I can put config.ru, but the reason that I chose this file name is because it's the default. So I don't actually have to put in the file name. I can just type rackup. If I wanted to call it application.ru, I'd have to then specify it. All right, so it started it up and it chose a different port. And it's still working here. Now, I'm going to implement a piece of middleware that comes with rack that I was alluding to earlier. So to implement a piece of middleware, I'm just going to use the use directive. And rack comes with a piece of middleware called rack reloader. By default, it has one parameter when you instantiate it. Its first parameter rather is an integer, and it's set to an initial value of 10. So what that means is every 10 seconds it can reload the code from my app, but I'm impatient, so I'm going to set it to 0. And I'm going to refactor this. Before I do, actually, I'm going to start that back up. This time I'm going to do it on port 3000 because I like it better. All right, so let's confirm that it's working. Perfect. And now I'm just going to keep that open. I'm going to keep the server running and refactor the body. And I'm just going to switch back over to Chrome and check it out. And there we have it. Didn't have to restart the server, and that's the purpose of that particular middleware. I've used a few others as well, and there's a lot of open source middleware. If you look it up, you're probably going to find something that is adding functionality that you think is pretty valuable to your application. Before we conclude, I'm just going to I've just modified this one a little bit. So if I switch to the master branch first. So I have the same application here with a little bit more functionality. I added stuff like ERB and style sheets. So if I just choose to rack up on port 3000 again. So you can do a lot with very little. Oops. And it's a fully functional website. You can deploy this to Heroku if you want. It's very quick. lot quicker than some frameworks which can contain a lot more functionality than you might need. I'm told one of the things I came across in researching this is that you can include in your Rails router a route to another rack application that might be smaller. I haven't experimented with that yet, but it's definitely on my to-do list. But that's all I have for you today, so I'd like to thank you all very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Are there any questions for Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, what's coming up with Rack 2?
I was actually just speaking with Arthur about it because he's working on it as far as I know. So I hear it's going, actually I don't know, but I heard some features that won't be in it. But I was interested to take a look at that. I was trying to use Rack 2.0, but it was running into a couple of bugs, so I decided to go with the safer release.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Let's do one more round of applause.